streets for the fact that you had made a decision during that war to survive. When we talk here about the Japanese comfort women, an estimated 140,000 young women, mostly teenagers from Korea, were forced into serving as sex slaves for Japanese troops. These girls report that they were raped and beaten at the outset before having served as many as 30 soldiers a day, while they lived in what euphemistically called comfort stations. The Japanese military relied on these women to reduce the incidence of sexually transmitted diseases among the soldiers by monitoring the health of these government sex slaves. Now here's one of the problems when it comes to World War II, is the Holocaust was such a horrifying phenomenon and dominated the public mind afterwards that when people sat down to rewrite the Geneva Convention, they oftentimes forgot about women. For the fact that genocide was the top concern, if you look through this, the Fourth Geneva Convention that was written in 1949 has 159 different articles in it. There's only one line dealing with the treatment of women and dealing with the issue of rape. It blatantly states, women shall be especially protected against any attack on their honor, in particular against rape, enforced prostitution, or any form of indecent assaults. Now here's one of the problems. If we don't take the issue of rape, it was put in section number 127. When it came down to World War II, yes, the Holocaust should have been number 1, but rape should have been number 2. And it's not something that ended with World War II. If you've ever read about politics in Latin America during the 1980s while the Cold War was still going on, one of the groups that was targeted during that period were Catholic missionaries. For the fact that Catholic missionaries were very sympathetic to the poor. In places like El Salvador, they were targeted as communists. Let me share the story of 4 American missionaries who were caught up in the Civil War in El Salvador. Ida, Mura, Jean, and Dorothy were nuns in the Catholic Church, and for some time had been working in Central America when they were killed. The 4 women had been invited to work with internal refugees in El Salvador by the Archbishop Oscar Romero in 1979. The women became good friends with the bishop up until his assassination in March of 1980. If you weren't aware of that, Archbishop Romero, for the fact he spoke out about the poor of El Salvador, was gunned down by a U.S. trained assassin during the middle of giving the sacrament. Goes on and says, the women were present at the funeral for Romero, where Salvadorian soldiers opened up fire on the crowd of mourners, killing roughly 30 people. The 4 women were murdered, their bodies taken to a clandestine location and buried. After their bodies were exhumed, it was determined that the 4 women were raped before they were murdered. The incoming Reagan administration was quite friendly with the Salvadorian government and suggested the 4 women were responsible for their own deaths. Now here's the problem with the way the Geneva Convention is set up. The only way you can prosecute somebody is if you conquer them first and you're an occupying power. As an occupying power, you can bring formal charges against whatever nation you're occupying. The problem is that means you have to go to war with that nation, and civilians always get caught up in the middle of war. One of the questions then, if you're a woman, if you have to go to the occupying forces to report a crime, what do you do when the occupying forces have committed that crime against you? Where do you turn to if you're a woman? You know, the reality for women facing this, number one, my own background, there's still to this day a huge social stigma attached to talking about rape, talking about sexual abuse. People don't want to talk about it, they feel guilty for it. That's a huge emotional leap for somebody. One of the other great dangers, if there were witnesses to that rape, for the fact you're going to go through a proper judicial process, is people murdering any witnesses to that rape and threatening to murder you to try and buy your silence. One of the most notorious cases of the 20th century involves U.S. troops in Vietnam, what became known as the My Lai Massacre in March of 1968. This is a report from the BBC in March of 1968 stating, "Soldiers went berserk, gunning down unarmed men, women, children, and babies. Families were huddled together for safety in huts or bunkers, were shown no mercy. Those who emerged with hands held high were murdered. Elsewhere in the village, other atrocities were in progress. Women were gang raped. Vietnamese who had bowed to greet the Americans were beaten with fists and tortured, clubbed with rifle butts and stabbed with bayonets. Some victims were mutilated with the signature C Company carved into their chest. By late morning, word had gotten back to high authorities, and a ceasefire was ordered. My Lai was a state of carnage. Bodies were strewn throughout the village." The reason why that was such a controversial event, Lieutenant William Kelly, who had been in charge of American forces there, was brought up on trial for war crimes, and he was given a life sentence. President Nixon utilized his power of executive pardon and gave Lieutenant Kelly 2 years of house arrest for this, because it was such a controversial era in American society. One of the things we need to understand about perpetration of violence then is the silence attached to it, and asking about different categories of perpetrators. Those who actually commit the rapes, tortures, and murders, those who encourage, direct, and command the rapists, torturers, and murderers, or number 3, those who are in a position to halt the atrocities despite international laws that forbid them, and allow the horrors to continue. If you were here a couple of weeks ago, you saw David Rovics perform. One of the individuals and great heroes of the 20th century that David Rovics first introduced me to, Lieutenant Hugh Thompson. Let me just share some song lyrics here with you. Hugh Thompson was there in my life, and he wouldn't stand by silently. David Rovics has written a song about him saying, "Hugh Thompson was a pilot, just like many more, fighting for old glory on a far-off foreign shore. He was on a lethal mission, only one of many, following his orders to kill the enemy. He flew low above the village, searching for the foe, when he saw a wounded child on the path below. He thought this was a sure sign that the enemy was near, so he radioed for backup, and more choppers did appear. 'Help the wounded,' he cried out, 'and beware of an attack.' And then the child died by a bullet through her back. And when he looked around for the culprits of the scene, it was a company of men in U.S. military green. The dead were in the hundreds, strewn all around, in this place called My Lai, which once had been a town. There was a hut of huddled children, soldiers had them in their sights. Hugh decided at that moment to fight for what was right. Train your weapons on the GIs. His copter crews obeyed, and stood among the children, tattered and afraid. Then the whole town had been murdered, but for some kids and widowed wives, and Hugh Thompson made sure that those remaining were to survive. One of the things that's horrifying about the end of the 20th century, if you study the 1990s after the fall of communism, is talking about the nation of Yugoslavia. One of the great tragedies of Yugoslavia, when it had been under communist rule, under the rule of Marshal Tito, who had been a hero of World War II, is that nation which for generation and century after century had been at war, actually found a time when they were at peace with each other. There's a quote here about Tito's rule where it said, Yugoslavia during that time was, quote, a genuine melting pot characterized by an atmosphere of secular tolerance. The problem with Yugoslavia is you've got Eastern Orthodox Christians, you've got Roman Catholics, and you've got Muslims who have traditionally fought things out for generations there in Eastern Europe. What's going to happen after the economic collapse of Yugoslavia is a new leader started to rise to power, a man by the name of Slobodan Milosevic. What Milosevic did is he played upon the fact that Serbia had a long tradition of being anti-fascist, and that Serbia had played a great role in defeating Nazi Germany during World War II. What he started arguing at the time was that since Muslims living in the former Yugoslavia were anti-Semitic, that these people should be targeted for genocide. One of the most notorious people being a Serbian general by the last name of Tadic, who became notorious whenever he captured a Muslim prisoner. He would chop off their genitalia in public and shove it down their throats to silence them. Here's one of the problems when it comes to the 1990s. It becomes very confusing with global politics. Because eventually the United States intervenes in 1999, leading a coalition of NATO forces to bring an end to this genocide that had been happening throughout the 1990s. One of the awkward things that had been going on right before that is Russia had gone to war against Muslims and the rebellious region of Chechnya. While Russia was at war with Muslims in Chechnya, we called the Chechens freedom fighters. They were terrorists fighting against the Russian government. And it became very confusing during the 1990s because a political movement had been founded in the year 1989 after the Iraq War, an organization called Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda initially was created to defend Muslims against the Soviet Union. What started getting very split here in the 1990s was the question, is the United States a friend or a foe of the Islamic people? One of the problems then when it comes down to the war in Yugoslavia, well, we helped to bring an end to that genocide. We toppled Milosevic's regime. One of the techniques that NATO started using there, and we still use on a daily basis, is the phenomenon of uranium-tipped shells, because they're very good at armor piercing. But it also leaves depleted uranium all over the countryside. And we're still using that in Afghanistan. You see this image down here. It looks like an alien. That was a baby who was born in Afghanistan just a couple of years ago. This is because that mother's child was exposed to depleted uranium. And the question with that is then, how do we treat this case? If you look at Yugoslavia and Bosnia, some examples of what the Serbians are going to do here. Serbian vehicles with loudspeakers roam the streets, accompanied by tanks blaring, "Muslims, get out. Surrender and everyone will be safe." Despite these assurances, between 2,500 and 3,000 Muslims were killed. 80 mosques were routinely cordoned off by the authorities and blown up. In the town of Berdenak, a local Muslim cleric was dragged to the soccer stadium where he was tortured, forced to drink alcohol, eat pork, make the sign of the cross before he was executed to the cheers of the crowd. Those Muslims who escaped were deprived of their livelihood. Their lights and utilities were cut off, and they were murdered and raped. What I'd like to do here for a moment is have a guest performer share a piece with you. If you've ever met Sky Warburton here, Sky is going to be performing a piece from what's called the Vagina Monologues. A woman by the name of Eve Ensler, after she had heard about some of the atrocities that had gone on in Yugoslavia, interviewed a number of women who had been raped. And this is a dramatic piece that she put together about the experience that women had there in Yugoslavia.
My vagina was green. Water, soft, pink fields, cow mooing, sun resting, sweet boyfriend touching lightly with a soft piece of blonde straw. There is something between my legs. I do not know what it is. I do not know where it is, not now, not anymore, not since. My vagina was chatty. So much saying, words, talking, can't quit trying, can't quit saying yes. Oh yes. Not since I dreamed there's a dead animal sewn in down there, with black, thick fishing line. And the dead animal smell could not be removed, and its throat is slit, and it bleeds through all my summer dresses. My vagina, singing all girl songs, all goat bell ringing songs, all wild autumn field songs, vagina home songs. Not since the soldiers put that long, thick rifle inside me. So cold, the steel rod canceling my heart. Don't know whether they're going to fire it or shove it through my spinning brain. 6 of them, with black masks, shoving bottles at me too. There were sticks in the end of a broom. My vagina. Swimming, river water, clean, spilling water over sun-baked stones, over stone clit stones, over and over. Not since I heard the skin tear and make lemon screeching sounds, not since a piece of my vagina came off in my hand. No one part of the lip, One side of the lip is completely gone now. My vagina, alive, wet,